All right, guys, this video is going to be about the fuel system in this Honda BF90D. This is a 2010 model. I've already got the cover off, and we are going to go sort of top to bottom, everything that I did to get this motor in tip-top and running shape. I've had this motor into the shop several times. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. So I decided to take the task on myself and just sort of troubleshoot from the boat all the way to the motor, and I eventually figured it out. But it wasn't easy. It took a lot of trial and error, and this motor wasn't throwing any code, so it wasn't real obvious exactly what it was, which led me to think that this is a fuel issue. It was having random issues. When you get it out on the water, this motor would sometimes run fine. In fact, I could run all day sometimes fine, especially when it was idle. But when I brought it up to any type of speed or RPMs, over time, in like 10, 15, 20 minutes, this thing would start acting up, and then start acting like it's fuel starved and had issues. So if your motor is doing that, this video might be a good thing to watch, so you can see what to look for and what might be areas and items that you may want to replace or check, just to make sure that you're covering all your bases. It's been running fine all day, and it started acting up, and this is what we're looking at as far as RPMs. Full throttle, and it was like 5,200 RPMs, and it just started having issues. So you can hear it possibly starting to sputter. A surge, sort of a surge. But eventually, what seems to happen is this thing will continue to whittle down into like a limp mode. All right, so resetting it. Starts up just fine. Lights are working. All right, let's see if I can get it above. All right, so that reset, and that seems to work fine after I reset it. After I turn it off, turn it back on. Let's see how long it takes to fail this time. All right, it didn't take long, maybe 30 seconds, and full throttle will only go to 4,000 RPMs, but you can hear the motor degrading. All right, first things first, start with your tanks. This boat has two fuel tanks in it. One here, one on the port side, and we got a switch here. And I have the starboard side over there. All right, but start with the basics. Make sure you have good fuel, non-ethanol, just regular unleaded non-ethanol fuel. The second thing is, make sure that your vent on your gas cap is working, okay? Make sure that's good and clean and clear. This one is. Make sure there's no water in your tank. This is all good, clean and clear, of course. And make sure that your pickups don't have garbage on them, trash, and that everything's connected properly on your pickup hose there. All right, the other thing that you want to make sure is that your male and female connectors, these two things here, are good, and they meet and made up well, okay? So they're matching connectors, because this boat, I had issues where these connectors were not matched up properly. Even though they worked, you could tell they weren't matched up properly. They wiggled around quite a bit, and one of them was sticking, so it was hard to get on and off. So make sure, if you're having those kinds of issues, just replace them and be done with it. So another thing you want to look at is if it's got any type of plumber tape, the white plumber tape. You see blue there, that's because I replaced the plumber tape that was on here with a sealant type of a fuel resistant sealant. Permatex makes it. Next thing is take a look at your lines. Make sure your hoses are good. My hoses were replaced. I replaced them all. Made sure that I had good hose clamps on everything. Things were tight and in the right spot, and there's nothing leaking there. So definitely take a look at your hose clamps. The next thing is, if you do have a switch on your boat, for a right and left fuel tank. In this case I do. Make sure that you take that apart, take a look at it, make sure that the fuel is flowing through there properly, and make sure your hose and hose clamps are good, okay, and they're tight and sealed and they're not sucking any air in there. And also make sure that there's no plumber's tape on those. All right, moving over to the fuel water separator. Again, making sure that your hoses are connected properly. There's no plumber's tape on these joints here and here. Make sure that your hoses are good and sealed properly with your hose clamps. If you're getting any type of yellow on your water separator, I would definitely check that. Make sure that there's nothing leaking there, okay? Because this was leaking and that's why it's yellow like that. And of course make sure there's no water in the bowl down there. Drain that out. Make sure it's good to go, and change out your water separator filter. All right, moving on from the water separator, making sure that your connector is good as well as your clamp, your hose is good all the way around here, and that your bulb is good, and that the connectors are good as well. As you see here, I've got this bulb mounted in the vertical position as opposed to horizontal. I've got it mounted this in a somewhat vertical position. That helps with that one-way valve function. All right, also on the water separator, as you see there, I've emptied my bowl on my water separator into like a little cup or bowl down here, and as you see, there's no water in there. All right, once you empty the bowl out of the water fuel separator, you're going to end up with air in the line, and you're going to have to disconnect this hose with the bulb that goes into the motor. You're going to have to disconnect that so that you can bleed the air out of the line. Same thing holds true if you change out the filter. You're going to have the same issue. So it's always good to know how to do this little trick with the arrow pointing upwards. What you're going to do is hold your finger over the end and squeeze the bulb, and then just let air out, and then put your finger back over. And as you see, it's starting to come back, the fuel's starting to fill back into the bowl down there at the bottom of the fuel separator, the water separator. And just keep doing that. Now the bowl is full, starting to fill up. So you keep doing that until gas starts to come out. And you have to be careful so you don't squirt gas all over the place once it gets near the top. So you just have to feel it as it starts to. All right, so now I felt it come, the fuel's in the bulb now. So I felt the fuel come into the bulb. So I'm gonna end up doing real slow. Okay, now the fuel came out a little bit. So now I'm ready to connect this back up to the motor. All right, now that we've got fuel back in the bowl and the water separator is filled back up with fuel, and the line is reconnected to the motor, the fuel line here in that joint, reconnected everything. Now we'll move on to the water separator on the motor, which is here. All right, before we get started on the motor itself, I wanted to show you what's in the service manual, specifically talking about the fuel system here in the maintenance schedule. Looks like replacing these fuel filters, they call them fuel strainers, the low pressure as well as the high pressure. It's every 6 months or every 100 hours you're going to check it, and every 400 hours you're going to replace it. I do mine a little more often than that for my replacement of my filters. It talks about fuel tanks, checking those cleaning those every 2 years or every 200 hours. And it looks like the fuel lines check and replace as well. Definitely you're gonna have to just kind of eyeball those. If it starts looking bad, you're gonna have to replace those. So just wanted to show you what's in the maintenance schedule, and so you get, as a point of reference. As you start jumping right into the motor, the first thing the fuel flows to is this water separator that's on the motor itself. So we're going to talk about that. All right, the water separator on the motor is fairly easy. And this is the inbound hose coming in, and this is the outbound, as you see the arrow going out. And that hose feeds over to the top of the motor on the port side over here to the low pressure fuel side, which is the filter and the pump back there. So we'll go through that in a minute. But first we'll pull this off. All right, to remove this water separator on the motor here, and you just basically kind of grab a hold of it and pull it out, and then we'll disconnect the hoses. All right, I pulled it off, and as you can see, it's held on. See these little holes there, these little slits. is mount right on top of these little metal bracket right here. It's real simple. So looking at this bulb to see if there's any water down there. Now there's a sensor here. You can see that sensor. If there is water in there, that sensor does trip. But also, if that water is that sensor is bad, it could cause issues. So I'll pull the hoses off and we'll empty that, and we'll just sort of take it apart and take a look at it. All right, I pulled the hoses off and I'm draining the fuel out of the tank here. All right, once you pull this out and take it apart, and you know you're inspecting this for any type of debris or issues with the floats are down at the bottom there. If you can see that. All right, and double check everything to make sure things are functional, that the float is moving freely. But if you see gunk in here or water in here, it definitely points back to the boat. So check your boat if you're seeing stuff that's built up in here. All right, we got everything reconnected on the water separator. So we're going to move over, continuing on with the low pressure side of the fuel system, on up to the low pressure fuel filter and the low pressure fuel pump. The low pressure side of the fuel system, jumping right into the fuel filter, low pressure fuel filter, as well as the fuel pump. Talk a little bit through that, changing those items out, and those are super easy to change out. Sort of a breakdown here in the manual, as you can see it. All right, continuing on the low pressure side of the fuel system. This is the low pressure fuel filter. This is inbound fuel going this way into the filter from the water separator that we just looked at. As you can see, the fuel flow is shown right here on the top. It shows you which way the fuel is flowing, and again going that way, and this goes to the inbound side of the low pressure fuel pump. Okay, and now this is a newer pump. The newer pumps, the inbound and outbound, are flipped. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, it's an easy way to tell that. What I do is I mark my hoses, and I also pay attention to what's on the fuel pump itself. You can see there's an arrow right there. So let me zoom in on that, and see if you can see that. Yep, there it is right there. These are super easy to change out. You know, this is sitting in a cradle. All you got to do is pop it out, take the hoses off, swap it out. This is 2 bolts, and you can pull that off, take the hoses off, you can pull that off and swap it out. All right, one thing you can do to make sure that fuel is flowing from your boat, from the bulb, all the way up through your low pressure fuel system, is to hang a small cup or something off the side, disconnect the tube that's connected to the VST, and put it in the cup here. And then all you have to do, just squeeze the bulb here, and should get some fuel, should flow all the way from the bulb through that water separator, all the way around up to the low pressure fuel system, and then down here to the VST area. Another thing you can do to test your low pressure fuel pump, keeping the hose disconnected from the VST into the cup, and then come over here to the console, pull your emergency shut off here, and then turn the boat over a few times, and that should pump fuel into the cup. Move into the high pressure side, talk about the VST, high pressure fuel pump here, as well as the high pressure fuel filter there. This is a little more advanced, and we'll show you how to pull that out. You see the bolts there, and how you disconnect everything and pull it out, put it on the bench, take a look at what I found inside mine, and sort of discuss that as well. All right, this is the vapor separator tank. This is the low pressure hose coming from the low pressure fuel pump. All right, that's right there, okay, feeding the vapor separator tank. The vapor separator tank gets full of fuel from the low pressure side, and then the high pressure fuel pump sits over here in this housing, and this is the filter that goes out right before it goes into You can't really tell and see, but this is the hose that feeds the fuel injector rail, okay? And that fuel injector hose cycles around here and up to the rail itself. My VST was just full of junk, and my high pressure fuel pump was rusted out, which caused all the junk, which also caused a bunch of clogging, and the filter was just completely clogged up with a bunch of sediment. So you know, in the troubleshooting steps in this fuel system, something you may want to consider, definitely swap out your filters or change out your filters when they're supposed to be changed out. That would have led me to this sooner. When I had my motor serviced, as you can see here, it talks about an element filter. I assumed that it was not just this filter here, but also this filter here. They did not change that filter out. Had they changed that filter out, they would have saw it was just completely gunked up. It may have led us to think about inspecting this. And in the end, I ended up finding it and realizing nobody changed this out. It probably was like that from day one when the owner had it before me, and they just never serviced the motor properly. So again, this high pressure fuel pump was completely rusted out and causing, it was still working, but it was rusted out, causing this entire tank to get full of junk. This in turn clogged up my injectors, okay? So having this full of junk clogged up my injectors, and this issue was so random that as things sloshed around in here, sometimes the sediment wouldn't affect the motor running. It would not run fine, and then sometimes it would just completely clog it up and just shut off, or just start running really rough, and almost like it's in a limp mode. One way to test the high pressure fuel pump is to disconnect your hose going to the fuel injectors and turn the key once, and you should get a 2-second pump into the cup here. All right, changing out the high pressure fuel filter, not too difficult to do, really easy. I loosened up the screws and let some of the fuel drain out of there. And so that's what I do, is just loosen it up, let's put a rag under here, let the fuel drain out, because it will drip some fuel out of there. And then finish taking the screws off, and be careful because there is a spring back there that's right here in the center. So you're gonna have to put some pressure on that so things don't start flying all over the place. All right, I pulled the screws off, just being careful with it. So just make sure you don't lose that spring in your screws. So more fuel's falling out of there. That's okay, we got a rag there. So the book says check it every 100 hours and swap these every 400 hours, or change these out every 400 hours. I probably do mine more often than that because of the issues I had with mine, just to make sure that I'm good. This is a Honda brand filter. They're very expensive, but I went with that because I tried some cheaper ones, and this little gasket tends to not last. All right, so I went with the Honda brand, and it's been working for me good ever since. All right, when you are changing this out, just inspect inside here, see if you got any gunk in here sitting in the bottom. Want to double check your O-ring. It's always good to have an extra 1 or 2 laying around for spares. What I usually do is put a little oil on there when I reseal it, just to make sure I get a good seal on that if that needs to be replaced. This one here I replaced not too long ago, so it's good. I'll put a little oil on there and put the cover back on. All right, to remove this VST, you got to take out that bolt, and you got to come around here and you got to remove these 2 electrical connectors, and there's 2 bolts back there, and I'll point that out with the screwdriver so you can see what they look like. All right, to remove these electrical connectors, you got to get in there with the screwdriver and move that little tab there that you see I'm moving to the left there, and then once you get that kind of in between there, you can pull that connector off. There you go, and it pops out of there. That's how you do it. Same thing with this one here. All right, once you get those electrical connectors out of the way, you can get in there with a socket right here on this bolt here and this bolt here. Not this bolt, but this bolt and this bolt. Now, one way this one up top is a little difficult to get to, even though it may seem easy. I ended up having to bend this little bar out of the way a little bit, or if you have an angled type of socket set, you can use something with a joint on it. That would help. That might be easier to do than what I did, but there's ways to get these out. It's not too difficult. But once you get those two bolts out and the one that's around the corner there, then the VST is fairly easy to pull. All right, one other wire that you're going to have to contend with is this one here that goes to the top of the high pressure fuel pump housing, and that connector is back there. So once you pull the VST, you'll be able to get in there with a little screwdriver and finagle that connector off. You'll have to remove these hoses, okay? You'll have to remove these water hoses down here at the bottom. This is the water jacket here. So you'll remove these two black hoses here, this one here and this one here, okay? And the rest of these hoses are fairly easy to take off. This is the other side of the injector hose. So you'll pull that. You had to pull this one off the bottom of the high pressure fuel pump housing there. Down here, yeah. Pull that one off the back side of that housing. But this whole entire thing pops out of there as one piece. Once you get the 3 bolts out of there, with this one here along with the 2 that are up front, and the hose is disconnected, and you get this electrical connector disconnected from back here. This whole thing comes out, and then you'll pull these. Once you pull it out, you can take it all apart. If you're servicing this, you're going to need gaskets, so prepare for that and have those on hand before you start tearing into that thing. All right, guys, I took the vapor separator tank off the motor, and I put it on my bench here, cleaned it all up. But what came out of this tank and high pressure fuel pump housing was the high pressure fuel pump, all rusted with all that stuff inside there, as well as this was in the tank. So as you can imagine, that would definitely cause a fuel issue. I'm guessing that this was caused by running ethanol based fuel and letting it sit. I'm gonna guess it was just sitting in here, maybe sitting outside, not used before I bought it, and it just caused that issue. So definitely make sure you run the right fuel in your motor that's non-ethanol, so that you're not having this issue. And we'll finally end with the injectors, and just kind of go through some of those, disassemble, what to look for, and those are fairly easy to replace as well. If you suspect you're having issues with your fuel injectors, I would definitely make sure you check your VST and high pressure fuel pump first and filter. Obviously you need to check all this before it even goes to your injectors, because if this has a bunch of junk in it, chances are your injectors will have a bunch of junk in it. There's nothing in the book that talks about replacing them or servicing them at any interval. What I'd like to do is just check them out and take a look at them, make sure they're looking good, make sure they're sealing properly. I just swapped these out, so everything's brand new. But there are little rubber seals and little rubber O-rings that come with that are on the injectors, and if those are wore out or messed up, you'll have issues with your fuel system as well. So just something to visually inspect. All right, I've pulled the connectors off of each of the plugs, unbolted the rail, and I pulled the fuel hose off. Now make sure that you have some sort of way to capture the fuel, because your fuel is going to come out of here and could get messy. So just put your hose off to the side, make sure you don't get anything inside here. You may want to cover it up, put a little baggie or something over it, just to make sure nothing drops in there while you've got this thing apart. And then we're going to pull this rail off, and the injectors are attached to the rail itself. All right, I just pulled the rail off. The injectors look good. Checked out the O-rings, all's well. These are new injectors anyway, so that should be good. Taking a look at the motor, all the ports that they plug into. It looks clean. All right, still good. Super easy to check these out. All right, got this thing on the water today. Do a little testing. So far so good. I've been running it for a little bit and without any issues. I got the GPS up here. We're gonna see how this thing does. All right, here we go. Definitely a lot better performance than it ever has. All right, no problem so far. No sputtering.